Our next presenters are Ansel, Colten Garland, and Justin Hornbuckle. They will talk about what does the future hold in this area of NIL.
Thank you, Bill. As he mentioned, my name is Justin Hornbuckle, and I will be briefly discussing how different NIL agreements are developed and some safeguards you guys should look for when forming an NIL agreement. NIL agreements can be developed for student athletes in a variety of different ways, but I will be discussing three of the most common methods. So first, through your school's relationship with different companies or brands. Your school may already have a list of different companies looking to do business with student athletes. So keeping in contact with your institution can be an easy avenue to obtain a potential NIL agreement. Just keep in mind, your athletic department may provide resources related to NIL activities, but can't facilitate NIL activities. Next, social media presence. As already mentioned, social media has been a common place where many student athletes have acquired deals with companies. So as a student athlete, keep in mind your social media presence and how that can impact a possible NIL agreement. This method has been very common because first, companies are likely to search your social media account to get to know you a little bit more about yourself outside athletics. But also, posting about the company or their products has frequently been the targeted deliverable that these companies have required as consideration for an NIL agreement. And lastly, third-party companies. This consists of having an account with a marketplace software or app, and their job is to bring in companies who want to connect with student athletes to form an agreement with. There are several apps currently out right now that act like this middleman in helping facilitate NIL agreements for student athletes. It's essentially a one-stop shop where you have an account and companies have an account, and you can interact with these companies through that marketplace so you can reach an agreement. Next, I would like to discuss some of the safeguards that you all should consider prior to actually reaching an agreement with a company. First, usage rights. Companies will likely want to use a student athlete's name, image, and likeness rights for as long as they see fit. But before coming to an agreement with a company, you need to consider setting up an exhaustion period that defines the length of the agreement and some of the limitations wanted for an agreement. Next, you have exclusivity clauses. A company may want you to only grant them rights to use your NIL. So prior to reaching an agreement, you need to know if this is something that is stated in the agreement so that you don't potentially violate that clause down the road. Or you may not find that exclusively doing business with one company is not the most advantageous for your circumstances. And then lastly, a force majeure clause. Unforeseeable circumstances can prevent a student athlete and the company from fulfilling a contract. The traditional force majeure clause excuses contract performance when some act of God or extraordinary events occur. Consider COVID. So depending on the terms of the NIL agreement, you all may need more flexibility with this clause, maybe because of unpredictable schedules with classes or team events. So you need to make sure that there is flexibility within these clauses to avoid potential penalties for not performing. And so I only mentioned a few of the safeguards to consider, but I just wanted to let you all know to be aware of some of these areas before finalizing an agreement. Feel free to contact me at this email if you have any further questions.
All right, hi, my name is Ansel, and I'm going to be discussing name, image, likeness for international student athletes. And as you'll see, it's very different than a domestic US citizen NCAA athlete. This past summer, when NIL became available for NCAA athletes, one of the first things that I thought of as someone with a hockey background, which is a sport that has a lot of international athletes, is this is going to be great for the NCAA because they'll be able to attract international talent at a higher level now that this opening for athletes to profit off their NIL is available. However, I quickly learned that that's not the case. What is the issue here? Well, now that there's a green light from the NCAA, international student athletes have a giant stop sign from the US government. So most international student athletes are on what's called an F1 student visa. So this visa is what allows them to study abroad here in the United States. But unfortunately, it has a restriction on off-campus employment. And now this definition of employment is very broad. It's even been known to exclude volunteering in positions that would normally be paid. So the only exceptions that exist for an F1 visa are on-campus employment with restricted hours. You can only work 20 hours a week, and this is usually your campus cafe, bookstore jobs, things like that. Practical training, which is usually towards the end of your college career. This would be very specific to your major, possible graduate studies, very big in the STEM fields, and goes through its whole specific certification process. And then finally, there are case-by-case circumstances that are considered for severe economic hardship. But if you see an F1 visa application, they tell you that, unfortunately, it's a little unfair globally, that you have to have the financial means to be able to come study, and while being restricted to not work based on these standards. Good thing though, there is some case law that can give some guidance on this. As you'll see, there are some options for international athletes. So a couple of cases from the 1980s actually define the difference between active and passive income. So the first case you see here, there was a student that was on an F1 visa and he was leasing ice cream trucks to vendors. Well, the courts deemed that this was unauthorized because it was active employment. It was self-employed, but again, the definition of employment includes things like self-employed. He was involved in the day-to-day operations. It was his own company, so this was considered active income and not allowed. And unfortunately, I believe the defendant was deported in that situation. And the second case here, this was not an F1 visa situation, but it was another non-citizen who had the same employment restriction. And here the court deemed that his signing on to invest in a hotel chain was passive income. There was no engaging in day-to-day operations, no involvement really in the business whatsoever other than the investment. So they were able to say that passive income is not considered employment. So let's see how this can apply to an international student athlete. As I'm going through this, also be a lot of cool examples were talked about throughout the presentation so far. So maybe consider as I'm going through this, how some of those past examples might work or not work, be authorized or unauthorized for an international student athlete. So yeah, so what does this mean for international athletes? So most schools are telling their international athletes to just stand by and do nothing. Immigration law and visa violations is very serious and can affect long-term things like getting a green card to work in the United States down the road. So that's my disclaimer, that always talk to your compliance department and your international student services before doing any of these things regarding NIL. So things that international student athlete probably can do. So any activity in your home country regarding NIL should be fine. Again, the NCAA allows it now. And the important thing with the visa violation is the physical location of actually being on US soil. So if you go home for the summer, you can be in a commercial in your home country, you can post on social media and get paid for that. Pretty much everything is fair game as long as it doesn't violate NCAA rules. You won't violate your visa if you're not in the US. But like the second you step on US soil, no more, you can't even share a post that you were paid for on social media. That could be considered a violation. But what NIL opportunities could be considered passive, even if you're on US soil? So a big thing that a lot of schools are having are these group licensing agreements, which is essentially if a school wants to sell jerseys with the athlete's name on it, they usually contract with a third party, and then that third party contracts with the athletes. So the school and the athletes aren't directly tied together, and this is called a group licensing agreement. And why this hasn't been attempted yet, based on the definition of passive employment, I think an athlete simply signing on to a group licensing agreement and doing nothing else would probably fall under passive income. This might seem like kind of a far-fetched example, but if people are trying to build a brand or product line with a name and logo with their sports number on it or something, potentially if you hired an agent or a management team and then were completely hands-off and let them run your line and you merely collected the profits after employing them, this could also be considered passive income. So think of other fun examples that you think might work. Like a restaurant pays an athlete just to hang their picture on the wall. The athlete does absolutely nothing other than reaps the benefit of having his NIL used. Again, probably passive income. That Jack in the Box example earlier was a pretty cool example. If all they have to do is sign off on their name and allow Jack in the Box to make them one of those Jack Leets, I think that would also probably fall under passive income. And again, always, if you have any ideas, always check with your compliance department and your ISS offices before doing anything. Oh, and just important to note, I was saying in the beginning, about 10 to 13% of NCAA athletes are international athletes. So it's a pretty solid chunk of the field that right now is restricted while their teammates are able to take advantage of some of these NIL opportunities. So where is NIL going for moving into the future for these international athletes? People I talk to say pretty much we're going to need a test case, or the so-called poster child situation to expedite change. Someone who kind of takes the risk on something that might be a gray area between passive and active income and really kind of tries to make it known that this is an issue. Fortunately, this issue has already been discussed in Congress. It's just a matter of which route are they going to take. The easiest thing you would think is just to either create an exception within the F1 visa category for student athletes, or add an entirely different visa category for international student athletes. And this would affect the about 20,000 NCAA student athletes that exist right now. However, what I think they should do, and a lot of people think they should do, is just simply remove the restriction from the F1 visa. It was put in there a very long time ago. A lot of people consider it outdated. This would then affect the 1 million plus international students across the entire country that are international students. However, with the approximately 10 million jobs available, there's a good chance that this really shouldn't have any type of policy issue moving forward. So yeah, my final thoughts. If brand image awareness really is that important to you and you're kind of nervous about if what you're doing could be considered passive or active, one thing that has been raised is the possibility of using your NIL to raise money for an important cause or charity back home. Because as long as you make sure that the money is never is never coming through you as a middleman, is always going directly to that charity or cause, then it should be totally okay. And of course, this can create some pretty good long-term benefits. A, you're helping something you believe in, and then B, down the road, that can come back and actually help you in a way that you can also reap the benefits of that brand or image awareness that you're creating. So yeah, contact me with any questions. My email's there, and yeah, there's a lot. This is a really interesting issue that I think as the months go by, as this is catching on, I really do think there will be something at the federal level, hopefully within the year. And there's a little bit of some misconceptions out there that the NCAA isn't doing enough for this. However, there's really not a lot they can do. This is totally a federal level issue. And I guarantee the NCAA wants to attract as much international talent as possible. And now that NIL is available for domestic athletes, that they also want it to be available for all NCAA athletes. And that's all for that presentation. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. So up next, I'm going to talk about what a lot of people see coming up next in the NIL world. One of the more important trends that many people predict is a trend towards less restrictive policies. So as we've discussed already, there's no uniform NIL rules. So states have some leeway when it comes to deciding what kind of restrictions they want to place on themselves. Ohio, for example, when writing their law, they specifically left some language out so that the schools in their state could kind of make their own decision on how they want their athletes to be restricted. Another, maybe even more glaring example of this trend is some states may be afraid they're falling behind in recruiting battles, and they amend their NIL laws or even repeal them completely. A good example of this actually is happening this week. A state representative from Alabama, Kyle Routh, came out in an interview and said he was rushing to change the NIL laws in his state. He had a quote really saying basically, we want to make sure our athletes in our state are getting everything that they can. And actually just, I believe in the last day or two, the governor approved this repeal. So that's something to look forward to, not just in Alabama, but something that many people believe could be coming down the line in many states. Another thing that I think should be really exciting for athletes and schools and companies as well. Like I said, because NIL is such a strong recruiting tool for schools and teams, schools are going to want these prospective athletes to know that their players are signing these big lucrative deals. Two really big examples of this BYU football. They were one of the first to do this because the state of Utah had pretty lax NIL restrictions early on. So what they did is they reached out to an alumni of BYU and said, hey, what do you think about putting together an agreement between your company, Built Bar Protein, and our football team? Of course, the owner of that company was excited. So what they did is they did a group agreement where for all of the BYU football walk-ons, all they had to do was show up to 2 in-person events and a couple of social media posts, and in exchange, they got some gear and they got their entire tuition paid for. So especially as a walk-on, if you see something like that, that's such a huge recruiting tool, and more states are going to want to allow that for their schools. Another really cool idea that I think should really be taken advantage of moving forward is the NIL Edge team from Ohio State University. So basically what this is a small group of staff in the athletic department that is strictly tailored to facilitate and educate both the student athletes and the brands on how they can get together for these NIL opportunities. So they do this in different ways. One way they do this is specifically have these staff members reach out to companies who they know are looking to partner with their athletes. And they sit them down, whether it's a meeting with a single company or it's events with multiple companies, and educate these companies and tell them this is what you can and can't do, so that they don't have to be afraid of breaking any kind of laws or developing legislation. And really, a lot of this power can be in your hands as well as athletes. If you can show to your schools, your institution, that you're really interested in these opportunities coming out of NIL, the school is going to be more likely to show a lot of focus on it and see what they can do for their athletes. So go to your athletic department, go to your coaches, go to other advisors, ask them what they are doing, what kind of policies they have in place, ask them what kind of ideas they have coming down the pipeline. And at the same time, when you go in to meet with them, bring in your own ideas. Maybe something you've seen in this presentation, something you've done some research and come up with on your own. They're going to love whatever kind of ideas you bring in. It could be a huge step moving forward for both you and for the school. Another huge thing you can do is just keep track of how these state laws are changing. Keep track of that. Talk to the people in your athletic department. Make sure you're staying up to date on what you're actually allowed to do. Just so you know where you stand moving forward with your NIL opportunities. So yeah, just like everybody else in the panel said, feel free to contact us. We'd be happy to answer any questions. I don't know if we're experts, but we'd be happy to help you however we can. And yeah, we'd be happy to help.
Thank you, Ian, Colten, and Justin for that information. As you guys have stated, it will be interesting to see where NIL goes moving forward.